They didn't even ask her name. No questions, no confirmation, no curiosity. Just two security officers walking toward her with purpose, like they had a target. A black woman standing calmly in the priority boarding line, phone in hand with her digital first-class ticket open and ready. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved out of turn. She hadn't done a single thing wrong. But that didn't matter. The gate agent had already made a decision before she got close enough to speak. And that decision was this: she doesn't belong here. It wasn't the kind of mistake where someone realizes their error and apologizes. This wasn't confusion over a seat number or a glitch in the system. This was judgment, swift, silent, deliberate, the kind that lives in the subtle corners of society, polished and polite on the outside, but cold and cutting underneath. The agent didn't even glance at the screen of her phone, didn't scan her QR code, didn't greet her like a paying customer. Instead, he leaned slightly to the side, tilted his head, and spoke 4 words that carried the weight of a verdict. "Ma'am, step aside." The officers didn't ask questions either. One gestured, the other stepped behind her like she might bolt. As if a woman in sneakers and a plain hoodie could be a threat to the comfort of first-class air travel. She complied, of course. No fuss, no resistance. But that didn't stop the whispers, didn't stop the stares. No one protested. No one stepped in. Eyes followed her, not out of concern or confusion, but out of quiet confirmation. To them, she was the one who didn't fit. Not with that skin, not with that quiet presence, not with that unbranded bag slung over her shoulder. To them, she wasn't someone who paid for luxury. She was someone who somehow slipped through the cracks of the system, and now the system was correcting itself. That's the part that stung the most. Because what no one at the gate knew, what not a single one of those passengers, employees, or even the security team could have imagined, was that this woman wasn't just flying first class. She wasn't just on a business trip. She wasn't just another executive. She was the executive, and the entire future of this airline was sitting right there on her phone, locked behind a digital signature they were now dangerously close to losing. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Her name wasn't important to them. Her ticket wasn't important. Her calm, respectful demeanor wasn't important. All that mattered was what they thought she represented. And in their minds, it wasn't power, it wasn't wealth, it wasn't status, it was otherness, it was discomfort, it was not supposed to be here. They didn't see Jessica Carter, one of the most powerful financial strategists in the country. They didn't see the person who had been entrusted to finalize a multi-billion-dollar merger with global implications. They saw someone who didn't belong, and they acted accordingly. So, as she stood quietly off to the side, security checking her ID like it might be fake, passengers stealing glances at her over their sunglasses and leather tote bags, Jessica didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She had already decided that this was exactly what she came for. Not to be treated with respect, not to be acknowledged, not even to be seen. She came to let the system show its true face. And within seconds of her arrival, it had done just that. It wasn't just the staff. The passengers behind her weren't confused or concerned. They were irritated, as if she had caused a delay, as if her presence in line was the real issue. A few adjusted their suitcases. A few whispered behind thin smiles. None of them knew who she was, but they were sure of one thing: she wasn't one of them. But Jessica Carter didn't flinch, because she knew something they didn't. The ticket in her hand, that was just a prop. The real seat she held, the real position, wasn't on this plane. It was at the table where companies are bought, sold, and shaped. And this little scene at the airport, it was about to cost them far more than they could ever imagine. And that's the thing about power. It doesn't always come dressed in designer labels or walk through life looking the part. Sometimes it wears sneakers. Sometimes it stays quiet. And sometimes it lets you dig your own grave before it says a single word. Jessica Carter had learned a long time ago that if you want to see how a company really treats people, you don't send a letter. You don't schedule a meeting. You don't wear a name tag that says VIP. You walk in quietly, you blend in, you watch. And so that morning, she left the power suits in the closet. No designer heels, no luxury handbag, no staff trailing behind her. Just a hoodie, comfortable jeans, and a pair of sneakers she'd had for years. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a look so unassuming, so ordinary, it made her invisible to the people who only see status when it sparkles. But behind that plain exterior, Jessica was anything but ordinary. She was the key negotiator in one of the largest financial deals in aviation history. Genesis Financial Holdings had spent years building its empire, and now they were about to close a $4 billion acquisition of Havenport Air, a merger that would reshape the future of the airline industry. Jessica wasn't just a consultant. She held final signing authority. One stroke of her pen could greenlight the deal or send it crashing into the ground. But before she approved anything, she needed to know one thing. What kind of company are we buying? So when the board of Genesis briefed her privately, they didn't send her in with a press team or a formal review committee. They sent her alone. "Don't tell anyone who you are," they said. "Don't wear anything that hints at your position. Just travel like a regular person and see what happens." Jessica took that challenge seriously. She booked the ticket herself, full price, first class, no upgrades, no favors. She arrived at the airport early, passed through security like any other traveler, and walked straight to the priority lane. The ticket on her phone glowed with bold letters, first class, priority boarding. But as soon as she stepped into that line, the energy around her changed. Whispers, stares, people stepping just a little too close behind her, like her presence was holding up the process. The gate agent, Kyle Thompson, according to his name tag, smiled brightly at the passenger in front of her, chatting easily, scanning their ticket without hesitation. But when Jessica stepped forward, his entire expression shifted. The warmth disappeared. His posture stiffened. The friendly voice went flat. "This line is for first class and business passengers," he said, as if he were informing a trespasser of the rules. Jessica didn't blink. She simply raised her phone, the digital ticket clearly displayed. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She just stood there, calmly holding the evidence. Kyle glanced at it. Not long enough to read it, let alone scan it. Then he leaned sideways, whispered to a colleague, and before Jessica could say another word, 2 uniformed officers were walking toward her. She could feel the passengers behind her shifting, sensing a disturbance. Some craned their necks, others looked away, but no one said a word. Not to support her, not to ask what was happening, not even to suggest they check her ticket before making assumptions. Jessica, meanwhile, stood perfectly still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't protest. She wanted to see how far this would go, how deeply this reaction was rooted. One of the officers asked her to step aside. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was sharp, controlled, like she was part of a routine check they'd performed 100 times. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked, her voice level. "Just a quick verification," he replied, a response that said nothing and meant even less. They didn't scan the barcode, didn't call a supervisor, just took her away from the line and made her stand awkwardly in a small corner near the check-in desk. Passengers walked by, casting glances. Some avoided eye contact. Others let their gaze linger, assumptions already forming. Jessica kept her phone in her hand, the screen still showing her ticket. But no one looked at it. No one cared, because they thought they had her figured out. And as she stood there, a thought settled deep in her chest. If this is how they treat me when they think I'm a nobody, then what's happening to people who can't fight back? That's when she knew. She had seen enough. She hadn't even boarded the plane, and the culture of Havenport Air had already exposed itself. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about a mindset, a default setting, one that judged people not by what they carried, but how they looked when they carried it, not by their behavior, but by what the staff assumed they were capable of. But Jessica wasn't just anyone. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to see. and in less than 5 minutes, the airline had given her a crystal-clear picture of the very thing she was sent to evaluate. This was no longer just a flight. This was the beginning of a storm they had no idea was coming. Because while Kyle and his colleague stood near the counter, feeling proud of their vigilance, Jessica Carter was standing in silence, already rewriting their future, with nothing more than the truth they had handed her on a silver platter. The moment Jessica stepped onto the plane, she felt it. That same undercurrent of silent judgment, the same glances, the same stiffness in the air. It clung to her like humidity. The gate agent had reluctantly waved her through after a double check with security, but the suspicion hadn't disappeared. It had simply followed her on board. She walked down the narrow aisle toward first class, past rows of passengers who either ignored her or gave her that quick up-and-down scan that didn't stop long enough to be polite, but lingered just enough to pass silent judgment. She arrived at her seat, 1A, calmly placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down without a word. She wasn't interested in causing waves. She was there to observe, to watch how this airline operated when it thought no one important was paying attention. And almost immediately the performance began, not from her, but from everyone else. Olivia Sloan, the head flight attendant, was already moving briskly through the cabin with polished precision. Her uniform immaculate, her hair styled into a tidy bun that framed a professional but distant smile. To some, she might have seemed like the embodiment of grace in the skies, but Jessica knew better. It wasn't about what Olivia did. It was about who she did it for. As other first-class passengers settled in, Olivia greeted each of them with warm towels and practiced kindness. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Davis. Can I get you a glass of champagne? Mrs. Langston, here's your menu. We'll be serving the seasonal tasting this evening." Polite, pleasant, attentive. She floated from seat to seat with that well-trained smile until she reached Jessica. And then the performance stopped. No welcome, no towel, no drink, not even a glance of acknowledgement. Olivia walked past Jessica as if the seat were empty, as if she were invisible. Jessica didn't react. She didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. 1 row, 2. Then Olivia returned to the front of the cabin, still engaged with the other passengers, laughing lightly at a joke from a man in a tailored suit, kneeling slightly to hand a drink to a woman carrying a Louis Vuitton tote. Jessica sat in silence, each moment of neglect wrapping around her like a slow, deliberate fog. She knew what this was. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't an oversight. It was targeted dismissal. The kind of subtle discrimination that hides under the mask of too busy or accidental, but is always sharp enough to wound. After a few more minutes, Olivia passed by again, still avoiding eye contact. This time, Jessica raised her hand, just a gentle lift, barely noticeable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I didn't receive a towel." Olivia stopped, mid-step, looked at her with a flicker of something behind her eyes, annoyance perhaps, but quickly masked it with a tight, almost forced smile. "Oh," she said, the smile not reaching her voice, "I thought you didn't need one. I'll check if we have any left." Jessica nodded once, said nothing more, and watched as Olivia walked away. But she already knew the truth. There were always enough towels in first class. The problem wasn't the supply, it was the perceived demand. In Olivia's mind, Jessica didn't deserve one. This wasn't just about towels or drinks or warm welcomes. It was about how people in power pick and choose who is worthy of basic respect. And the game hadn't ended yet, not by a long shot. 10 minutes later, Olivia returned, not with an apology, not with kindness, but with an entirely new tactic. She was holding a tablet now, her expression tighter, more serious. Her smile was gone, replaced with a look of strained professionalism. She leaned in slightly, her voice hushed but cold. "Miss Carter, we've received an update from the ground crew regarding the weight distribution on this flight. Unfortunately, we're going to need to ask you to move to economy." Jessica looked at her, unblinking. "For weight distribution?" she asked evenly. Yes, Olivia replied, nodding quickly as if rehearsed. It's a delicate balance, and unfortunately, your seat has been identified as needing to be adjusted. Jessica said nothing for a moment. She simply studied Olivia, the carefully composed expression, the slight twitch in her hand gripping the tablet, the way she wouldn't quite meet her eyes. This wasn't policy, this was punishment. A subtle push designed to shame her, a test to see how much she'd take before backing down. I paid in full for this seat, Jessica said calmly. I'm not aware of any policy that asks individual passengers to move mid-boarding based on seat location, and certainly not in first class. Olivia stiffened slightly, but kept her voice clipped. We're just following safety protocols. Jessica didn't move. If safety's the issue, she said quietly, maybe you should ask another passenger. Why me? That question hung in the air like a blade. Olivia had no answer, at least not one she could say out loud. So she gave the only reply she could manage. I'll inform the captain of your refusal to comply. And with that, she turned and walked briskly away. Jessica sat still, unshaken. She wasn't just defending a seat. She was testing how far the facade of civility would stretch before cracking. And what she saw confirmed what she'd suspected all along. This airline didn't have a customer service problem. It had a culture problem, one so deeply woven into the fabric of its people that it operated on autopilot. But what Olivia and the others didn't know, couldn't even begin to guess, was that Jessica wasn't just some random woman refusing to be mistreated. She was the one person who could decide whether Havenport Air's deal lived or died. And right now, the airline was failing, miserably. Because while Olivia tried to push Jessica out of first class, Jessica was quietly preparing to pull the rug out from under the entire company, not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Because if they treated her like this, then they were treating others like this, every day. And she wasn't about to let them get away with it. The tension hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. Jessica remained in her seat, staring quietly out the window, but her mind was racing, not with panic or anger, but with calm, deliberate thought. She had been ignored, dismissed, singled out, and now nearly removed from first class altogether. Yet the flight wasn't even halfway through. She knew there was more to come. The behavior wasn't just situational, it was systemic, and all she had to do was sit still and let it expose itself further. It didn't take long. From the row just behind her, a voice pierced the air. Not loud enough to be shouted, but sharp enough to slice through the cabin's hush like a knife. I don't understand how someone like her is sitting in first class. The sentence didn't even try to mask its contempt. It came from a man with silver hair, a tailored navy suit, and the kind of arrogance that was built not from intelligence, but from decades of unchecked privilege. His name, Jessica would later learn, was Robert Davis. But in that moment, he was just another echo in the long corridor of systemic judgment. He didn't say it quietly. He wanted people to hear, and people did. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. Some passengers smirked behind their glasses. Others simply looked away, uncomfortable but not surprised. Jessica didn't react. She didn't even turn around. She just let it land. Let him dig his own grave, one word at a time. Robert wasn't finished. You fly first class often enough, he continued, speaking to no one in particular, but making sure everyone was listening. And eventually you expect a certain level of clientele. His pause was theatrical, as if waiting for someone to agree, to nod, to validate his prejudice with polite silence. And then came the worst part. Olivia, the head flight attendant, returned to the scene like she had been summoned by the scent of entitlement. She approached Robert with her usual practiced charm, leaned in slightly, and offered the kind of response that said more than the words themselves. Sometimes people use miles to upgrade, she said softly but audibly. It happens, it's unfortunate, but we try to accommodate everyone. It was a performance, a quiet alliance, The flight attendant and the businessman connected not by truth, but by a shared discomfort with a black woman in a space they believed she had no right to occupy. Her presence, her existence in that seat, was enough to unravel their idea of what first class should look like. Jessica felt the sting of it, but she didn't let it show. She had trained herself for moments like this. She had heard these kinds of insinuations before, in boardrooms, on golf courses, in client dinners where the real decisions were made long before she walked through the door. But today felt different. Today, she wasn't here as someone asking for inclusion. She was here to judge the very system that thought it had judged her. She turned slightly, just enough to face them. Her expression was unreadable, calm, director. And then, in a voice that carried no anger, only truth, she spoke. I wasn't aware that dignity was reserved for those who look a certain way. I paid for my ticket just like you, and as far as I understand, respect isn't something you have to upgrade to. Robert's smug expression faltered, just for a moment. Olivia, too, blinked with hesitation, caught off guard by Jessica's composure. Neither of them had expected her to speak, let alone with that kind of confidence. Jessica didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult them. But what she said carried weight, more than either of them realized. Still, Robert tried to regain control. I'm just saying what others are thinking, he muttered, looking away, refusing to meet her eyes. Some of us work hard to earn our place here. Jessica didn't smile, didn't flinch. And some of us work even harder, she replied, to make sure people like you realize who really runs the show. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats. A few glanced at Jessica with surprise. A few others looked away, ashamed. But one thing was certain. The cabin had changed, not because of raised voices or confrontation, but because someone had finally held a mirror to it. The rest of the flight passed in a kind of uneasy quiet. Olivia avoided Jessica's row entirely. Robert fumed silently, checking his phone every few minutes, pretending he wasn't affected. But Jessica, she remained still, as composed as ever. She knew that real power didn't need to shout. It didn't need to demand. It just needed to be present long enough for the truth to reveal itself. And the truth was this. Every action, every comment, every slight was being recorded, not on camera, but in memory, in observation, in the quiet calculation of a woman who had the power to make or break the very company trying to humiliate her. When the plane landed, Jessica stayed seated as the other first-class passengers rose to grab their designer bags and filtered toward the exit. She moved with calm precision, taking her time, not rushing. But as she stepped into the aisle, two men appeared at the front of the plane. Airport security. Again. They scanned the rows, made direct eye contact, and walked straight toward her. "Miss Carter," one said, his tone rigid, "we need you to come with us for a brief conversation." A familiar hush fell over the cabin. The same eyes that had watched her board in disbelief now followed her with suspicion and curiosity. Robert smirked. Olivia folded her arms and looked satisfied. Jessica simply nodded, and as she followed the officers off the plane, she thought one thing and one thing only. You've just made the worst mistake of your professional lives. Because what was waiting on the other side of this so-called conversation wasn't fear or submission. It was the moment they'd learn who she really was, and what it would cost them to treat her like she was nothing. The interrogation room was cold, not physically, though the flickering fluorescent lights and blank gray walls gave it that sterile, uncomfortable feel, but emotionally. Cold in the way people act when they believe they have power over you. Jessica sat in the metal chair without slouching, her back straight, her expression unreadable. The two officers who had escorted her off the plane stood by the door like statues, not speaking, not making eye contact. It wasn't until a third man entered, older, heavier, with the kind of presence that said, "I'm in charge," that the questioning began. He placed a thin file on the desk with a deliberate thud, opened it slowly, and cleared his throat like he was preparing for a performance. "We've received a report from the flight crew," he began, not bothering with small talk. "There were concerns about your behavior during the flight. Disruptive, defiant, uncooperative with safety instructions." Jessica let the words land. She didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. She simply watched him, quietly, her hands resting in her lap, calm but precise, like a chess master waiting for her opponent to make a mistake. He continued reading, this time quoting directly. "Refused to comply with seating changes requested by flight staff, caused discomfort among other first-class passengers, exhibited suspicious behavior prior to boarding." He looked up at her, as if expecting an outburst or protest, but Jessica simply tilted her head slightly and said, "I see." That response unnerved him more than shouting ever could, because in that moment he realized she wasn't confused, she wasn't afraid, she was assessing him, and then she reached into her bag. The officers standing near the door tensed, ready to step in. But Jessica didn't move with urgency. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, pulling out a thick envelope sealed with a deep red wax stamp, embossed with a crest that very few people in the aviation industry would fail to recognize. She placed it on the table and slid it forward. "Before we continue," she said in a voice so steady it could have stopped a riot, "I suggest you read this." The room went still. The man in charge, Eric Dempsey, head of airport security, hesitated. Then, curiosity getting the better of him, he peeled the wax away and opened the folder. What he saw made his mouth go dry. The letterhead bore the name Genesis Financial Holdings in bold. Beneath it, a legal confirmation of Jessica Carter's identity and her role as lead negotiator, final signatory, and executive decision-maker for the $4 billion acquisition of Havenport Air. Not an assistant, not a representative, the decision-maker, the woman who could, with a single call, freeze or finalize the biggest deal in Havenport's history. Dempsey blinked, then looked up at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. You're her." Jessica simply nodded. "Yes, and every minute we spend here is another mark against your company's name." One of the officers by the door swallowed hard. The other took a half-step back. Dempsey looked like the ground had been pulled from beneath him. He tried to recover. "Miss Carter, I didn't know. We had no idea. The crew didn't—" Jessica raised a hand to silence him. "That's the point. You didn't ask. No one did. You assumed, over and over again." Her voice was still even, but the words cut deep. "At every point in this process, you had the opportunity to do the right thing, and you chose the path of least respect." Dempsey opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced down. One notification. One name, Leonard Westbrook, the CEO of Havenport Air. She accepted the call with a quiet swipe. "Miss Carter," came the voice on the line, strained, frantic, trying to sound composed, but failing. "I just received word from Genesis Holdings. They've informed me that the merger is on hold, indefinitely. Can you tell me what's going on?" Jessica didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, let him feel it. Then, softly, she replied, "Your company failed its final evaluation." "Evaluation?" Westbrook repeated, the panic sharpening now. "I don't understand. We followed every protocol." "No," Jessica said. "You followed protocol for the people you recognized as important. But you failed the most important test, how you treat the ones you assume aren't." There was a pause on the line. Then Westbrook's voice returned, quieter now. I want to fix this. Please, Miss Carter, let me make this right." Jessica looked up at Dempsey, who was now visibly sweating. The two officers stood frozen, guilt written all over their faces. She returned her gaze to the phone. "You don't make it right by asking me for forgiveness," she said. "You make it right by tearing down the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." And then she ended the call. Within the hour, the fallout began. A flurry of internal calls, executive meetings, and panicked memos were triggered by her revelation. The deal's collapse sent shockwaves through the boardroom. and everyone, from flight attendants to airport staff, suddenly found themselves under a microscope. Reports were pulled, security footage was reviewed, and names began to circulate. Names tied directly to what had happened: Olivia Sloan, Kyle Thompson, Robert Davis, Eric Dempsey. One by one, the people who had felt confident enough to dismiss her were now watching their careers crumble in slow motion. But Jessica wasn't finished. The next day, as she walked through the terminal on her way to a private lounge reserved for executives, she spotted Olivia. Not in first class, not even in uniform, just standing by a domestic gate, dressed down, waiting for a short-haul flight like any other employee. Their eyes met. Olivia froze. Jessica didn't speed up. She walked calmly, each step echoing with silent authority. When she reached Olivia, she paused, gave her a long, cool look, and finally said, "You were right, Miss Sloan. I don't belong in first class." Olivia blinked, startled. I never... Jessica cut her off, not with harshness, but with something far more final. "I came to buy the whole thing." And with that, she walked away, leaving Olivia standing still, stunned, as the weight of those words crashed down. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was absolute, because sometimes power doesn't show itself in how you enter a room, it shows in how you leave it. Jessica Carter had never needed to shout to prove who she was. She simply gave people the chance to show who they were, and then decided what to do with that truth. And this time, the price of their assumptions wasn't just a few apologies or disciplinary letters, it was $4 billion. And the painful lesson that next time, before judging someone by what they wear or how they look, you might want to ask who they are.